Welcome everybody to Our Voices Heard. This is a webinar about using an anti-oppression framework in sexual violence advocacy and prevention work. My name is Megan Asadian. I'm the outreach coordinator at the Rape Recovery Center. I'm going to do a little bit more of a formal introduction later, but I just kind of want to do some housekeeping really quickly. With me today is Jorge. I don't know if people can see you, Jorge, but he's here. Jorge, say something.
Hello.
So Jorge is mostly here to kind of help moderate this whole thing, make sure that everything is functioning correctly. You know, if some technology thing happens, he'll be here to support. He might chime in every now and then to kind of add to the discussion here. But it's mostly me today that's going to be facilitating this webinar. Another thing that I wanted to point out is that there's a Q&A option that everybody should have access to. And so it's down here, should be towards the bottom of your screen. And so if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to submit your questions. And then Jorge will make sure to stop me wherever I am in the presentation to make sure that I can address your question. Having said that, you are more than welcome to submit your questions as they come up. There's no particular part of the presentation where you have like a Q&A, there's a Q&A. You can submit questions all throughout the presentation as they come up for you. And then towards the end of the presentation, I'm gonna try to fit in a Q&A section, but there's a lot of content, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started. So welcome to Our Voices Heard. And happy Sexual Assault Awareness Month 2020. The Rape Recovery Center celebrates Sexual Assault Awareness Month every April, and it's our biggest outreach month of the year. This year we had so many amazing events planned out, but unfortunately we had to cancel all of the in-person events due to the current need to social distance. And so we had to be really creative and innovative and work on a whole new virtual Sexual Assault Awareness Month kind of last minute, and this is part of that. If you don't already, please follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and we also have a YouTube channel, and you can check out our accounts right here. The theme for this year's Sexual Assault Awareness Month is Our Voices, and Our Voices centers around the idea that everybody in the community can use their voice in some way to contribute to the fight against sexual violence. And we'll get more into that as we go forward in the presentation. All right, I'm just going to do a formal introduction. Many of you probably know who I am because we've probably worked together, but for those of you who don't, my name is Megan Asadian. I use she, her pronouns. A little bit about my background. I am a University of Georgia alum. Go Dogs. I majored in biochemistry and gender studies. With the intent of going to medical school and becoming a doctor one day. And I'm very happy to say that I will be attending the University of Utah School of Medicine starting in August, so I'm very excited about that. But currently I serve as the outreach coordinator at the Rape Recovery Center, and I work on our outreach and education team. And essentially what I do is I go out in the community and I talk about sexual assault awareness. We go to workshops, we do workshops in high schools, we go to universities, we go to staff meetings, businesses, like different places in the community, health fairs to table, all about spreading awareness of sexual violence in our community, how people can get involved, and also to spread awareness of our services at the Rape Recovery Center. And I'll go a little bit more into that later at the end of our presentation when I go over our resources and how to get involved specifically. The other thing I like to talk about is that I am the daughter of an Afghan refugee mother and an Iranian immigrant father. There are two reasons why I like to disclose that part of myself. One, I'm very proud and very loud about my cultural upbringing, but also being the daughter of two immigrants has largely informed how I approach this work, and specifically how I approach this work using an anti-oppression framework. And so I always think that's important to disclose. And then one other thing I like to make sure folks know is that I do facilitate a support group at the Rape Recovery Center. It's our Women of Color support group. And so if you're interested, feel free to contact me and if you're interested in getting involved in that group. And again, my contact information will be at the end of this presentation. So let's kind of go ahead and get started and jump into it. So our voice is heard, addressing sexual violence using an anti-oppression framework. A little bit of backstory and why this webinar exists. Back in August, my team, so me, Jorge, and our supervisor, Stephanie, we all went to the National Sexual Violence Conference in Philadelphia. It was a really awesome conference, but there was one particular workshop that we attended. I believe it was the first one, and it was called This is America, and it was about addressing sexual violence using an anti-oppression framework. And throughout the workshop, we watched different music videos by different artists addressing oppression in different communities. Because the title was called This is America, the first video we watched was This is America by Childish Gambino. Highly recommend watching that music video if you haven't. But it really kind of got the wheels turning for me and how we approach the work that we do specifically at the Rape Recovery Center and how we can continue to grow in using an anti-oppression framework. And so that kind of inspired these conversations between myself, Jorge, and our supervisor, Stephanie, to figure out ways that we can do a little bit better in our own programming. And, you know, we're continuing to do that work, but that is largely what inspired this presentation. And so this presentation is going to kind of show how we have approached an anti-oppression framework in our prevention and our outreach specifically. But to lay out the specific goals for today in this webinar, I want to kind of go back to the basics, and I want to understand the difference among the terms prejudice, discrimination, and oppression, because when we say anti-oppression, what do we mean by that, right? And especially when we talk about oppression, a lot of people tend to talk about, kind of conflate the term with prejudice and discrimination, so I want to make those distinctions super, super clear. So once we lay that foundation, I want to then jump into exploring the history of sexual violence advocacy movements in the United States particularly, and how that history of movements impacts current dynamics in the field today. And then we're going to jump into exploring what an anti-oppression framework looks like in prevention, advocacy, and healing services. And then we're going to try and put it into practice. And I'm going to offer some insights that I've experienced on my team doing this work, as well as what I've seen other folks do in the community. Okay, really quick plug about self-care. This is my cat, Timmy. He is the love of my life. I'm a huge cat person. For those who know me, that's like the first thing that they know about me. And his name is Timmy. And I made this meme that I constantly refer to when I'm facing difficulty or when things feel hard. And it says, when Timmy says to be kind to yourself, you be kind to yourself. And so this is my cat reminding you to practice self-care throughout this webinar. We are kind of in the middle of a pandemic. Things can feel a little heavy, and we're also talking about oppression and really difficult things. And so I think practicing self-care is super, super important, and being kind to yourself during this time is super important. And what that can look like is stepping away from the webinar if the content feels a little heavy, taking some breaks. We're going to be delving into a lot of content, and so if you want to like step away from the webinar, go to the bathroom, get something to drink, that is totally fine. Okay. All right, so let's jump right into definitions. What is oppression? And specifically, what's the difference among the terms prejudice, discrimination, and oppression? Normally, what I tend to do when I do workshops like this is I list out the definitions, then I ask folks for examples of every single one of those definitions. And that's fine, but it's not like super interactive a lot of the time. It doesn't really tend to sink in for a lot of folks because these can be kind of complex terms. And so what I did was I actually saw this really valuable resource from a site called Everyday Feminism. I've linked the particular site at the end of my presentation if you would like to refer back to it. But I found this really awesome like little comic that kind of goes into the difference among the terms with examples. And so we're going to kind of go through that. So what is the difference between prejudice, discrimination, and oppression? Well, what is the difference? They tend to show up together, don't they? Well, while they have related meanings, they're actually describing specific things. Prejudice is typically referring to internally held biases. These are preconceived opinions and emotions that live inside of our heads about individuals or groups, and they can be both positive and negative. Everyone has prejudiced thoughts, even about groups they belong to. Prejudice is often unconscious. You aren't always aware of the biases and preconceptions that are influencing you. And I'd like to kind of add something here too. Prejudice is often unconscious, but that doesn't mean we can't acknowledge our own prejudice and we can't reverse some of those internal biases that we have. And so some examples, and I will warn you, some of these examples can be particularly triggering, especially if you identify with a lot of these things or if you've experienced these things. So just kind of a little warning. But just like a few examples here, Muslim people are more likely to be terrorists, disabled people are less capable and intelligent, these kind of internal thought processes that, that folks hold and are sometimes unconscious, right, but can be very negative and harmful. So that's prejudice. Let's jump into discrimination. Discrimination is the externalization of prejudice. That means that it's what happens when those internal biases are acted upon in the real world, right? So the thought process is the prejudice, and then the action is discrimination. And so if somebody has a particular prejudice against like LGBT identified folks right here in this top left corner. I'm sorry, I don't rent to homosexuals. It's not against you personally. It's just not a lifestyle I support. That is an example of discrimination, an action based on a prejudice that somebody holds, right? This one over here to the right, excuse me, I'm seated next to a Muslim man in seat 4B on flight 229, and I think I saw him typing something suspicious on his phone. It was in Arabic at least. And then this person's like, I'll look into it. That's a form of discrimination, right? Based on this prejudice that somebody holds against Arab or Muslim people, okay? This other one down here, look at me, I'm disgusting, who would ever love me? It's really interesting that they included this graphic because you can actively hold prejudice about yourself or your own community or group, right? And you can actively discriminate against yourself, as you can see in this graphic. And then the last one, William, as your guidance counselor, I feel like I need to encourage you to have more realistic expectations about what you can accomplish in your future. And that is definitely an example of discrimination against somebody who has a disability, right? Okay. And then when we get into oppression, oppression is defined as the systemic weight of prejudice and discrimination on the people it affects. Oppression is when prejudice and discrimination is supported and encouraged by the world around you. It's when you're either harmed or not helped by government, community, or society at large because of your identity. Oppression serves both actively and passively to uphold normative constructions of social power, such as patriarchy, white supremacy, and ableism. We're going to go a little bit more into that because the bulk of this presentation focuses on how to use an anti-oppression framework. So we have to have a really good understanding of what oppression is. Huge emphasis on this large-scale systemic approach of discrimination. Oh, there we go. And some examples here. I'm going to kind of fly through these because we're, again, going to dive into this a little bit deeper. But from this comic, I'm sorry, it's not illegal in this state to deny housing to someone because of sexual orientation. So because there's no legal backing, discrimination is a lot more widespread, right? And so that's an example of what large-scale oppression. Or right here, Donald J. Trump is calling for a complete and total shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what the hell is going on. So another example of large-scale oppression that can enable discrimination. All right, and I actually really like this graphic. I use this graphic a lot. It's from the Women of Color Network from a little bit ago, actually, 2007. But this is really helpful to kind of envision what the difference between prejudice and oppression is. We know that prejudice is that prejudgment, that internal process that all of us actually have. But if you add power to the equation, which is the capacity to exercise control over others, that's what equals oppression, which is systemic. It's systemic discrimination against members of certain groups. Okay. And then the last part of this comic, these three things form a cycle because oppression is systemic, it makes bias normal, and it reinforces those biases in individuals. And so prejudice informs discrimination, right? And discrimination informs oppression. But one really interesting thing is oppression informs prejudice, right? If we see wide or systemic oppression we can see how that also informs prejudice and kind of confirms people's internal thought process, right? And so this is a cycle and it has to be broken. And then you can't really define these terms without going into privilege and how specifically it can shape our internal bias. So privilege exists when one group has something of value that is denied to others simply because of the groups they belong to, rather than because of anything they've done or failed to do. Access to privilege doesn't determine one's outcomes, but it's definitely an asset that makes it more likely that whatever talent, ability, and aspirations a person with privilege has will result in something positive for them. And so privilege is kind of this thing that we all have, right, into some capacity. And the interesting thing about privilege is it kind of makes us a little bit more unaware of certain realities too. And it can definitely shape our internal biases and how we think about certain prejudices and so on and so forth. And so a huge part of this work that I want you all to think about as we go through this presentation and we talk about an anti-oppression framework, I want you guys to keep in mind that understanding and acknowledging privilege, especially within yourself, and kind of acknowledging that internal bias is a part of the process, right? It's a part of putting that anti-oppression framework into action as you're continuing to do sexual assault advocacy or prevention or activism. All right. Okay, so let's kind of jump into the systems of oppression. When we talk about large-scale oppression, what am I talking about? I like to refer to them as the isms. Most of them are isms, although not all of them are isms. But a lot of the ones that we like to talk about are racism, sexism, classism, ableism, ageism, heterosexism, and of course homophobia tied into that, and transphobia as well. And so these are some major systems of oppression that are important to keep in mind as we go forward in this work. Okay, so this is kind of where we get into like the bulk of this presentation. Let's introduce this framework into history. Let's kind of see how systems of oppression have informed how folks in the sexual violence field have approached this work, okay? For many of you who don't know, rape and sexual assault advocacy, sexual violence awareness, all of these different things kind of stem from the feminist movement in the United States. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with the feminist movement, it kind of occurred in waves, is what we like to call them. And so the first wave actually happened in the 19th and early 20th century, huge focus on voting and property rights, the women's suffrage movement. It's really important to note that in this first wave, this was largely organized by middle to upper class white women who had a certain level of privilege to be able to speak out. And they did amazing, important work, right? But that's just an important thing to consider, who was really at the table in the first wave. And then we kind of jump into the second wave, which you'll see I've highlighted here in yellow. And this has been classified as the women's liberation movement. There was a huge emphasis on reproductive rights. And this is actually when we see rape crisis centers and women's shelters popping up. You'll see that I put RRC represent the Rape Recovery Center was actually part of this movement. I think we were founded in 1974, right? So we were kind of right in that second wave as well. There's all this momentum around these different spaces for folks to go to if they've been impacted by sexual or domestic violence. This is finally becoming an issue that's not confined to the home. There are safe spaces that survivors can go to. So this is kind of when that starts building a little bit more momentum. And then we have the third wave, which was a huge focus on individuality and diversity. You'll see I highlighted the term intersectionality. We're going to get back to that in a little bit. Feminist multicultural theory. This kind of was a huge focus in the 1990s and early 2000s. And then right now, where a lot of people will argue we're in a fourth wave that is largely focused on the global impact of feminism, addressing violence against women internationally, a huge emphasis on social social media and #MeToo, addressing rape culture large scale, and then also a little bit more of a push for LGBTQ inclusivity within the feminist movement. And so arguably we're kind of still in this wave as well, depending on who you ask. But I actually want to go back to the second wave, this era of when rape crisis centers were popping up and women's shelters were popping up. And I kind of want to talk about the impact of this, right? So I'm asking, why is this history important to consider what was lacking? I kind of want to like focus a little bit more, going back to this, on that second wave. What were some of the positive things that arose from the second wave? Well, people had spaces they could go to outside of the home for help if they had experienced violence within the home. People were at least talking a little bit more about sexual violence and domestic violence, right? So again, gaining that momentum. But what were some of the consequences around this? And specifically, who was not at the table during this movement? I mentioned that in the first wave, this was largely started by white middle class to upper class women, right? And so when we see the second wave movement, we see a lot of these rape crisis centers and women's shelters popping up, but who is actually going to these shelters? White, cisgender women, right? Who was not going to these shelters? Women of color, LGBTQ survivors, and anybody who essentially wasn't necessarily a white cis woman, okay? And that's a really, really important thing to framework to understand as we go into this conversation. So I'm gonna give one historical example. This one I like to point out for many different reasons. There's so many different examples of different cases in history where certain communities were negatively impacted by sexual violence and did not seek or were not able to access resources and things like that. But I do want to point out a very particular case. To my left here, I don't know if y'all can see my my cursor. To my left is a woman named Reese Taylor. She's a Black woman who I think lived in the South. This is around the Jim Crow era, and she was gang raped by a group of white men. She discloses this to her family, to her community, eventually, and it got all of this attention, even national attention, but there was no justice sought. The white men were not held accountable at all, and it was just one example of many cases where Black women were not able to seek out justice or even basic safety after they experienced sexual violence. And to the right of Reese Taylor is Rosa Parks. So many people know Rosa Parks as the woman who refused to sit at the back of the bus, and that was really awesome and amazing. But what people actually don't really know about Rosa Parks is that she was a sexual assault investigator. And so she actually worked on Reese Taylor's case, and she investigated the case and risked her life to really seek out justice for this particular survivor. And she did this a lot for Black women. And so that's a really fun fact about Rosa Parks that many people actually don't know. If you want to hear a little bit more about this case, just for y'all to remember, there's a documentary. I think it's called The Rape of Reese Taylor. It's a really great documentary. Highly recommend it. But yeah, I wanted to spotlight this case specifically because it laid cases like this laid the framework for what's about to come in that third wave of feminism. And so the result here was a need for a framework that focused on the most marginalized communities, arguably, especially during that time. Black women were among the most marginalized, right? And explores how multiple forms of oppression intersect, okay? There was this really unique situation, especially when it came to cases where Black women were being sexually assaulted as a result of racism and sexism and all these different systems of oppression, right, that were very unique to their experience. And so that was something that folks needed to be a little bit more mindful of. And so kind of fast forward into this third wave of feminism, there is this person named Kimberle Crenshaw, And she kind of coins this term intersectionality. Intersectionality, probably a lot of folks have heard about intersectionality. And if you haven't, we'll kind of go into it a little bit. But she specifically, Kimberle Crenshaw, worked in the sexual violence field. And she was noticing that a lot of women's shelters and crisis centers were not really able to reach Black women or immigrant women who had been impacted by sexual violence. And so she wrote this paper, and I have a link to the paper at the end of this presentation, but I took this little paragraph from the paper, and she wrote, "Although racism and sexism readily intersect in the lives of real people, they seldom do in feminist and anti-racist practices. And so when the practices expound identity as woman or person of color as an either-or proposition, they relegate the identity of women of color to a location that resists telling." Okay, so essentially, sexual assault services were not geared to really service folks who had experienced intersecting forms of oppression, right? Especially in the case of women of color. And I actually liked this quote by Audre Lorde, who is a feminist poet, and I look up to her a lot. But she said it best: "There's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives." So many different systems of oppression that play out here that impact a survivor's experience, that rape crisis centers and women's shelters, especially at that time, were not keeping in mind, right? Okay, so now we have intersectionality as this framework, right? And this is another quote from Kimberle Crenshaw years after she had originally coined it. "But intersectionality is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. It's not simply that there's a race problem here, or a gender problem here, and a class or LGBTQ problem there. Many times that framework erases what happens to people who are subject to all of these things." And so that's a really important thing to keep in mind. This framework, while it was originally centered on women of color's experience post-sexual assault, it kind of became this framework to really understand how systems of oppression interlock and intersect with each other, and how that can inform somebody's experience through something, and particularly through sexual violence, as we're going to be talking about in this presentation. Okay, so applying the anti-oppression framework to sexual violence with an intersectional approach. I'm gonna go ahead and call out my coworker, Jorge. He is our prevention coordinator at the Rape Recovery Center, and he really says it best. You cannot fight sexual violence if you are not willing to fight racial violence, if you're not willing to fight homophobia, if you're not willing to fight these systems of oppression, because they are all so deeply intertwined with each other. And so Jorge says it way better than I do, because he's like the prevention person and he knows how to word things way better, but it's actually very true. And we're gonna kind of go into that a little bit more with some exercises towards the end of this presentation. Okay, so putting it into practice. I mentioned that Jorge and I attended a national sexual violence conference, and one of the presenters of the workshops that I attended was from the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape, or PCAR, as they like to be called. I highly recommend PCAR as a resource when you're looking at systems of oppression and how they intersect with sexual violence. They have so many amazing resources, and this is actually one of them. This is what we call the racial and sexual violence pyramid. And so I'd like to know a few things. With this pyramid, it doesn't specifically have to be just racial and sexual violence. You can actually use this pyramid or this activity with many different systems of oppression. So for example, you can do a pyramid on sexual violence and the intersections with homophobia or transphobia or other systems of oppression that we've mentioned in this presentation. But they specifically have one for racial violence. And I actually kind of want to go through it really quickly so that we can kind of see how these things get perpetuated and how they get how they're very much so deeply intertwined with each other. This is the blank copy. Usually what I do when I facilitate this activity is I have people fill it out together, but since we can't do that on this format, I'm gonna go ahead and give you the answers. I do apologize. I know that it's a little bit difficult to see, so please bear with me. Feel free to shoot me an email and I can send you a copy of this as well if you're interested in accessing this resource after, but we're gonna go through this really quickly. So on one side of the pyramid, you can see sexual violence, okay? And at the very bottom, you're seeing attitudes and beliefs, and then you go up a step and you're seeing individual acts of prejudice, discrimination, violence, and then death, right? And so what this pyramid activity is really trying to do is to see how attitudes and beliefs inform prejudice, which informs discrimination. It goes up as it pertains to sexual violence. And then we're gonna do the same thing with racial violence. And then on the side here in the kind of grayish, brownish area is when we're gonna see the intersection specifically between sexual violence and racial violence at all of these different levels, okay? And so starting with sexual violence, so the teal side of this presentation, some attitudes and beliefs that perpetuate sexual violence. She was asking for it. Boys will be boys. Girls should stay home. Men can't get raped. Typically what we think of as rape myths, if you're familiar with the term rape myth, anything that's like kind of widespread and believed that's actually not true and is very harmful to survivors or people who've been impacted by sexual violence, right? So these attitudes and beliefs that are perpetuating sexual violence. And then we kind of jump up ahead, individual acts of prejudice related to sexual violence. So rape jokes, street harassment or objectification. Then a step above is institutional discrimination that perpetuates sexual violence. So harmful gender-based stereotypes and traditional gender roles that are also very harmful. And then of course, when we go up to violence, rape and sexual assault, especially widespread rape and sexual assault is the result of that. Let's go back down to racial violence right here in the yellow. So attitudes and beliefs at the very bottom here. I don't see color, not all white people, right? So largely discounting the experiences of people of color and their experiences with racism, right? And that perpetuates racism, right? And then a step above attitudes and beliefs are individual acts of prejudice. So racial slurs, racial profiling, cultural appropriation is definitely an act of prejudice. And then a step above that, institutional discrimination, is racial profiling, gentrification, mass incarceration, and anti-immigration laws. My apologies, my cat is right here and he's meowing at me. He somehow got in. I'm so sorry. Okay, my apologies for that. And then a step above that, race-related violence, hate crimes, police brutality, right? And so some of these really important things that we have to keep in mind. Going over a step aside from that is the intersections between sexual violence and racial violence, right? So how do these things play out together? So we have attitudes and beliefs. Forgiveness of a perpetrator, more likely to forgive a perpetrator if they're white, not as likely to believe a person of color who's a survivor, right? Going up to individual acts of prejudice, problematic language, jokes, sexualized language, fetishism of women of color specifically, and victim blaming. And then we're looking at institutional discrimination, which focuses on reproductive control, English-only services for folks who don't speak English, who've been impacted by sexual violence. It's a huge barrier and is an example of institutional discrimination. The judicial system for sure. And then a step above that, violence, physical assault, verbal abuse, sexual violence against communities of color specifically. And then at the very top, you'll see death. Unfortunately, death is like the very extreme consequence of these forms of violence, but is super important to keep in mind. And that's very much so related to adverse childhood experiences related to racial violence and sexual violence, lynching, especially historically, genocide, and neglect in healthcare. It's a very, very heavy activity. I know that feels very, very heavy, but it is so important to kind of see the connection between different forms of violence, especially the connections between sexual violence and other systems of oppression that perpetuate violence. And yeah, And so it's a very important activity. I do really like this activity because it connects attitudes and beliefs, some of those more widespread things that exist, to these like very like large scale serious things. And so they're all deeply connected. And again, this is from the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape. If you have trouble finding it online, but you think it's a valuable resource and you want to use this activity to connect sexual violence with other systems of oppression, my contact information will be at the end. And so feel free to shoot me an email and I can provide that resource. Okay, let's put this into action. So we have defined what oppression is. We know what the systems of oppression are. We know how they kind of play out. How can we put this into action? Largely the work that outreach and education, I should really say specifically Jorge does, because he's our prevention coordinator, is putting this framework into prevention work. So when using this framework in primary prevention or just generally in sexual assault education, we have to move beyond just inclusive prevention education. So one of the things after, the national conference we went to, one of the things I was thinking about is, what do we already do? I know like Jorge and I will go into workshops and we'll try to use gender neutral pronouns, or we'll try to acknowledge that sexual violence, impacts certain communities of color at higher rates and so on and so forth. And that's inclusive in a sense, but it's not enough, right? That's good, but it's not enough. So the next question then is, what could a prevention framework look like that is intersectional at its very foundation? We don't have that fully figured out, full disclosure, but we have a few ideas and what we have been trying to put into practice a little bit more in our own programming. So many of you know that rape and sexual assault are the result of power and control. Perpetration happens when someone uses violence to exert power and control over another person. It's also important to acknowledge that different forms of violence are about power and control on both individual and systemic levels. So when we're talking about systems of oppression, like racism, like classism, like heterosexism, those exist because they perpetuate power and control, right? And so one thing that we actually tend to use in our programming is what we call the Wheel of Power and Control. Y'all are probably super familiar with the Wheel of Power and Control if you've been in the sexual or domestic violence field for a while. But for those of you who aren't familiar with this wheel, we use this to kind of explain different dynamics of power and control that can exist within a relationship and how it can be related or how it can be connected to physical or sexual violence. And so in this wheel, you'll see examples of using coercion and threats, using intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation, all of these different ways to make somebody feel small and to exert control over them, right? That's considered abuse, right? And then on the outskirts here, we see physical and sexual violence, either being the consequence or going alongside those dynamics of power and control. But the reason I bring that wheel up is because the wheel of power and control can actually be adapted and kind of like more specific to certain communities. And so in this next wheel, we see this being more specific to LGBTQ survivors. And so, and this is a really great connection to see how systems of oppression can also play into somebody's experience, specifically in the LGBTQ community, right? And so you'll see very similar dynamics here, power and control, using coercion and threats, using intimidation, emotional abuse, very similar to what we see over here. But if you look closely, it's very specific to what one might experience within the LGBTQ community. And I'd like to point out, this is not a perfect wheel or 100% representative, right? But you can kind of see how power and control can exist on an individual level and can also be influenced by a systemic level because of heterosexism, homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. I think we have a question. Can I access it? Let me see.
Yeah, it's just about where can you get the Wheel of Power and Control?
Oh, where can you get the Wheel of Power and Control? That's a really great question. Honestly, I just Googled the Wheel of Power and Control. And you can just like click on images and there's like so many different wheels of power and control. The one that you'll find the most the most common wheel of power and control is going to be this one, right? This kind of basic one. But if you type in wheel of power and control LGBTQ, you'll see a wheel of power and control that's like this one, right? That's more specific to that community. This next one that I'm going to show you, I'm so sorry, it's blurry, y'all. But this is more specific to like immigrant communities, right? So you'll see some of the similar dynamics of emotional abuse, economic abuse, sexual abuse, things like that, that establish power and control, but also using citizenship or residency privilege against somebody, threatening them with disclosing that information and making somebody feel really unsafe. And that is an example of how somebody can exhibit power and control on an individual level, but how it's also connected to a systemic level, right, of xenophobia, of racism, of things like that.
And there's also some on, like, say, teen dating violence.
Yes.
So there's a couple of specific ones to different groups and different situations. Another one I also really like to always promote is the wheel of equality, which is the opposite of the wheel of power and control. And I find that a lot of people maybe sometimes have a hard time fully understanding the wheel of power and control. But when you show them the wheel of equality and you see what a healthy relationship should look like, that seems to really click with a lot of people. So that's pretty powerful to search as well. And that's just the wheel of equality.
Yeah, very great point. Jorge actually uses the wheel of power and control a lot more than I do, because he's hardcore prevention, and really I'm more just like outreach and awareness. I do use the wheel of power and control sometimes when I'm like talking to high schoolers, but it's a really good resource, especially for younger folks who are just trying to understand like how to like practice, you know, healthy norms in a relationship and things like that. And it really generates really great discussions. And there is a teen power and control wheel as well. And of course, that wheel of equality that Jorge was talking about, great resource. So yeah, I would Google search it. That's how I find them. But again, if you have trouble finding these resources, feel free to shoot me an email and I will definitely send those resources your way. Okay. So addressing sexual assault with an anti-oppression framework largely involves viewing sexual assault as related to power and control, both individually and systemically, right? Being super critical of how these systems of oppression perpetuate dynamics of power and control. But another way that we can use an anti-oppression framework is how we address rape culture when we're talking about rape culture. And so some of the ways that we typically address rape culture, and by the way, I'm going to go ahead and define rape culture. We officially define rape culture as the normalization and trivialization of rape and sexual assault, right? Kind of not holding accountability for folks who have perpetrated sexual assault, perpetuating these really harmful norms that kind of cause sexual assault and rape. And so that's rape culture, right? And rape culture is largely tied to rape myths, these like widely held beliefs about rape and sexual assault that are actually really harmful and untrue, like victim blaming, or what was she wearing, or boys will be boys, those types of things. And those are so crucial to address when you want to, you know, talk about sexual violence. It's so important to address rape culture and challenge those rape myths that we hear all the time. But another way that we can address rape culture is by kind of taking that anti-oppression framework and that intersectional approach as well, and being a little bit more critical in how we address rape culture. And so I know a huge part of when I have these discussions with folks in workshops about like, what is an example of rape culture? A lot of people will say, well, representation of women in the media, objectification of women's bodies, violence towards women's bodies. Yes, absolutely. But then also taking it one step further, the hypersexualization and exotification of women of color, right? These like really harmful norms that specifically target women of color, or the negative portrayal of people with disabilities in the media, right? And how that's extremely harmful and also contributes to rape culture, but we don't talk about that as much. Another thing that I wanted to mention that I noted here, being critical of transphobia that's perpetuated in these discussions and the severe harm that it causes. I know particularly there are some, I think, politicians that were trying to create a bathroom policy or bill to be that was just inherently transphobic, right? And the argument was from them was that they didn't want trans folks perpetrating or committing some type of sexual violence towards other folks. And that's just simply transphobic, right? We know that that's actually not true, that trans-identified folks are more likely to be victimized in these situations as a result of this transphobia. I think we have a question.
It was just a follow up on the will of power and control.
Oh, okay. I can answer that, yeah.
Just, yes, I was looking specifically for the different versions. And again, you can just Google wheel of power and control, LGBTQ, or wheel of power and control, teen dating, or immigrant.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Okay, awesome. And okay, so yeah, so being critical of how transphobia is perpetuated in this as well, and how that also contributes to rape culture. And then another example I like to talk about is negative portrayals of men of color specifically, right? The fact that, you know, society at large tends to view men of color, specifically Black men or Latino men, as more likely to commit crimes because of mass incarceration, but we actually know that that's because of widespread racism, right? But how that is also part of rape culture, when we just assume that somebody like men of color tend to be more violent, right? Or in a sexual assault case, that men of color are more likely to serve, you know, time in prison than white men who have committed the same crimes, right? And so that's rape culture as well. Another thing too, perpetration rate comparisons. I didn't want to add this, but I didn't want to add this because I couldn't remember the exact study, so I couldn't put it here, but I think it was conducted by Julie Valentine. And she has done a lot of research in this field, and she's a really great person to look into if you're curious. I think she's located in Utah. She's based up in Provo, I want to say. I'm not 100% sure. But I remember her once saying in this training that I was sitting in on that she was noticing that a lot of women who were disclosing rape and sexual assault were more likely to disclose their rape and sexual assault if they were perpetrated by a man of color versus a white man. And so that like negatively skewed a lot of their data and was largely related to racism, right? And so those are just some things to think about as you're addressing rape culture using that anti-oppression framework. And then, not to like shamelessly plug our Sexual Assault Awareness Month programming, Our Voices, but the whole point of Our Voices is about uplifting different voices in the community and really empowering different folks to use their voice to end sexual violence. And so my question is always, whose voices are at the table to actually end sexual violence? I always say that I'm really critical when I go into a space and everybody kind of just like is the same or comes from like one community, because you're not really able to solve a widespread issue like sexual violence when you just are having one community represented, right? And so the whole point of Our Voices for Sexual Assault Awareness Month is about empowering everybody to come to the table and to contribute their voice to end sexual violence in their communities. And this is super, super important to have a diverse group of people at the table, because we are not the experts in every community, right? And we want to empower folks to be able to make that change in their own communities. And so that's inherently like intersectional at its core and very anti-oppression related. And again, I'm so sorry, my cat wants a lot of attention right now. I thought I locked him out, but I didn't. So my apologies if I'm looking away. I'm trying to tell him to stop through my mind. Okay, so the other thing to keep in mind, so that's kind of on the prevention side of things. So we're looking at rape and sexual assault as crimes of power and control. And we're making the connection with systems of oppression that also exhibit dynamics of power and control and how that impacts survivors. We are also challenging how we talk about rape culture and how we approach like ending rape culture. And that's like largely prevention focused. Of course, it can be applied to like, you know, secondary and tertiary prevention, counseling, healing services, but kind of going more into like how we provide trauma-informed care to survivors. There could be like a whole training on how to do this, how to provide trauma-informed care to survivors, especially survivors who come from marginalized communities. But I'll just say this, a huge part of that is understanding that survivors from those underserved, underrepresented, and marginalized communities, due to these systems of oppression, may experience not only quantitatively more issues related to sexual violence, but also qualitatively different issues than compared to those who do come from more privilege. I think we had a question. Jorge?
Okay, the question is, I'm curious how an anti-oppression lens addresses intergenerational abuse, especially in communities of color, and how that impacts how communities respond to or even acknowledge sexual abuse. I'm thinking of families who have had sexual abuse by family members, and at times it is normalized or hidden.
That is a very good question. And Jorge, feel free to chime in too. That is such a great question. And I think part of the anti-oppression framework is understanding that intergenerational trauma happens, and that it's harder to access resources or to even talk about those issues. But that healing can also, there was a really beautiful thing that I read that that really addressed healing and intergenerational trauma. That's a really good question. And I think is one that I would have to like sit on for a little bit, because that's yeah, that's a very, very important and important question to think about, and something that does come up, especially in a lot of communities of color, especially in my own community. Jorge, do you have any insights? Because that actually is a very, very good question.
Yeah, it really is. And it's interesting, because I think it's not just with, families, and communities of color either, right? It's something that happens across the board. Yeah, I think it's something I'd have to kind of sit with as well too a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I'll definitely look into that.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely important to acknowledge kind of the impact of intergenerational trauma. And that's another part, I suppose, of the anti-oppression framework, is acknowledging that as well. And I do think a lot of that goes into the next part that we're going to talk about, which is the healing piece. And I don't even know if this is going to be like a sufficient answer, because that is a huge question, and it's such an important question as well. But I do.
Yeah, and historical trauma obviously affects, how people interact with law enforcement or anyone else, right? That's something that happens with immigrants, obviously. They're afraid to reach out because of, past history.
Absolutely.
So it just adds more layers that makes it even more difficult to reach out for help. I mean, even in our practice at Rape Recovery Center, we've spent almost 10 years on trying to provide every service we have in Spanish as well as in English.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really proud of that work, but it's still hard to get people from the Latinx community to access our services. And it's improved, but it's still a challenge. And I think a lot of that is that fear that it might involve law enforcement, or you just don't reach out for help as much.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think this next part potentially might offer some insight, but kind of like going into that qualitative piece, right? Like, not only are we are folks from marginalized communities quantitatively experiencing more issues, like maybe lack of access to certain resources, barriers to reporting, systems of oppression, XYZ, right? But also qualitatively different issues that are really difficult to talk about with providers as well. And so there has to be a way to address healing and empowerment for survivors in a way that isn't your traditional talk therapy, right? Which is totally fine and great and amazing. But especially at the Rape Recovery Center, when we have this focus of trying to service those who do come from those underserved communities, we have to think of ways that healing and empowerment makes sense for certain folks. And so a lot of what we've seen is building community and reconnection specifically, which is actually part of our recovery model. the very last part of our recovery model is reconnection, or connecting with people who make you feel empowered, or people that you trust. And a lot of that for a lot of folks is connecting with people in their own community. And that doesn't necessarily have to be your family. That doesn't have to be, somebody like a group that you live with. It could be, but it could also be with other folks who, come from, your religious background, or come from, your cultural background, or come from like a unique position. And so building community with folks like that can also feel empowering and healing as well. And then one thing I also kind of wanted to mention too, as an example of this, as a service that we offer at the Rape Recovery Center specific to for women of color. I mentioned that I facilitate that support group, and I wanted to mention it here because that group, it's not a process group. It's not therapy. I'm not a therapist. I actually show up to that group as a participant, as a woman of color. And we talk about a lot of different things. We talk about, intersections between racism and sexism and all of that stuff. Sometimes we talk about microaggressions we've experienced. Sometimes like we cry together, right? And that feels healing as well. And that is a safe space for us to have, to be able to, not feel minimized, to be able to talk about whatever we want, and to kind of have that level of support. And so I think a lot of, in my experience, healing and empowerment, while it is great and amazing to go to therapy and talk with clinicians and things like that, a lot of it really is about building community and finding those spaces as well. Okay, so to wrap it up, and I think we have a question, and I want to get to this question before I wrap it up.
So just as an example of your point, Tarana Burke has discussed her personal experience with childhood trauma and fear of police involvement and the backlash that could impact her family. Mm-hmm. She might be a good person to look for more discussion on anti-oppression and intergenerational trauma. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Whoever submitted that, could you point us more in the direction, is it a podcast or is it a particular recording?
Tarana Burke? No, she has a lot of work out that you can research into her work.
Tarana Burke, yeah, I know Tarana Burke, but like just generally Tarana Burke's work, not like a specific podcast or anything.
Oh, I'm not sure.
Okay, if there's a specific thing by her that you want to share, please share. But Tarana Burke is great. Tarana Burke, correct me if I'm wrong, is one of the founders of #MeToo.
The founder.
The founder. Yeah, she's great. Yeah, absolutely. So to kind of wrap it up, in order to truly end sexual violence, we must also be committed to fighting against these different systems of oppression. You cannot end sexual violence without being committed to ending these systems of oppression. Say it again, you cannot truly end sexual violence if you are not committed to ending these systems of oppression. And so that is why it's really, really important to have that framework. So I guess this is kind of the part of the presentation where I've wrapped up all of the content and now I have just information about getting involved. This is also a really good time for questions. If you have them, feel free to kind of share those as they come up, but I'm going to kind of go into how you can get involved. We do host our 40-hour training. So if you liked the content that you heard here and you want more, we do host 40 hours of it. Our next one's going to be in June, and that one's going to be in English. We have one in August that's hosted in Spanish, and then we also have one in October, I believe, that's in English. And if you are interested in signing up for those, you can visit our website. I think we have a question.
Yeah, and it's Tiffany just saying that generally her work, but she also discusses that particular example in an interview with Brene Brown in her podcast, Unlocking Us.
Okay.
The second episode.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Tiffany.
That's really, really helpful. Thank you, Tiffany. Also, hi, Tiffany. Okay. So yeah, we host 40-hour trainings, and if you want more information, please visit our website or feel free to contact me about those trainings. And then these are kind of the resources that I used. Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape, highly recommend them. They know their stuff. That link up here, Everyday Feminism, that was where I actually took the comics at the very beginning. Kimberle Crenshaw's paper right here, Mapping the Margins, Intersectionality, Identity Politics, and Violence Against Women of Color. great read, very academic read, but very good. She is a genius and she is amazing. This was like a little blog that I saw that was really cool, written by a prevention coordinator who was, I think, working for California Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And then the last resource I actually did not use for this presentation, but they're the Washington Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs. They have amazing programming specifically related to like making the connection between systems of oppression and sexual violence. There's 2 questions, I think, 3 questions. Go for it.
Yes, so Christina's asking, how do you work with your organization and with partners to acknowledge and break down biases? Do you have particular tools or resources you use?
Yeah, that's a really good question. What I've done in the past, and of course, I think Jorge tends to be the one that gives more of those trainings. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think we balance them between each other. Yeah. It's usually more likely that we give trainings like this particular training or this particular webinar I created, a very similar one for a 40-hour training I did for UCASA. So I typically do these types of trainings when I'm training folks to become volunteers or interns through those 40-hour trainings, not to my recollection for other organizations that we partner with. Although
I know that's something that, you've mentioned the conference, from last, and I think that really kind of brought it up to the forefront for us. So it got us thinking about it. So over this year, this couple of months or half a year, what we've been doing is going through and kind of questioning everything that we're doing, from our trainings we do for high schools, how to make them more inclusive, how to address those issues, and kind of pulling them apart and starting them again from a different foundation, a different perspective. And so that's something that our partners, even the teachers we work with, have mentioned how it's really opened up different discussions with the students when we give presentations. Even with some minimal changes, it's really opened up a lot of conversation. So we haven't really done any work with trying to change other organizations, but I think since we've been thinking about it and talking about it, it has opened up a lot of conversations when we interact with individuals or organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. I think we have quite a few more if we want.
Yeah, another one is having me maybe do this in Spanish for community. We hadn't thought of that, but yeah, I think that'd be awesome. I would love to do that.
Absolutely,
so yeah. We'll keep you updated. Follow us on Facebook and we'll update it there.
Yeah, and Jorge will do it because he's amazing and will be, yeah.
And thoughts on addressing oppression with victims in tribal communities?
Absolutely, super important. That probably should have been part of our Sexual Assault Awareness Month programming from the get-go. We actually work with Restoring Ancestral Winds quite a bit, and they're a really wonderful resource in addressing sexual violence within that community, and specifically highlighting the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so definitely an important community to spotlight. And there are really great community organizations that we work with, and we're currently working on how to integrate our own sexual violence resources and prevention work more with that community. So really great question.
And I actually, I'm in the works with RAW right now, Restoring Ancestral Wind, on putting something together like this specifically about tribal community. So again, just follow us on social media. We'll keep that updated.
Yeah. Next question.
That's it for now.
Oh, is that it?
Mm-hmm. Oh, no, hold on. Great webinar. It would be great to get a follow-up webinar on how to implement an anti-oppression lens into service provision and organizations. Practical how-to.
Absolutely. I think that's super, super needed. I think a lot of that content actually tends to get covered in our 40-hour trainings. So part of this is also a plug to take our 40-hour training if you can. And then we do host certain trainings on how to respond to crisis, or how to work with specifically a feminist multicultural framework when we're doing, like when we're doing counseling or therapy services, that our clinical and our advocacy team tend to host a little bit more. And so definitely shoot me an email and I can connect you with the right people when it comes to facilitating those types of presentations.
Yeah, and I gotta say that, you know, we're very conscious of this and trying to do this work, and it's still difficult. So it takes a bit of work, but I think it's rewarding, you know, and it's good to understand your blind spots, you know, that we have, even though me and Megan will easily spend 2-3 hours in the office sometimes just talking about these things and realizing some of the things that, you know, we still need to work on. And so a question, Karen wants to know if the 40-hour training will be in person or virtual, and it's going to be virtual at this point. We're pretty sure that will be the case.
Yeah, good question though. Mm-hmm. And also just to kind of add on to that as well, if you sign up through our website and you want to, and you apply, we'll send you those updates as well once we have your application and we go through your application. Okay. Was there another question?
No, Kimberly just said, thank you, great webinar.
Oh, thank you, Kimberly. And I think another thing I want to make sure that folks have access to as well is that they can access our services. We are still running as a team. If you have questions about what resources you can access, feel free to call our office line that's currently functioning from Monday through Thursday from 9 to 5. And then we also have a crisis line. I should have specified it is a 24-hour crisis line that you can access anytime of the day throughout the week. You can press 1 for an English-speaking advocate or 2 for a Spanish-speaking advocate, and then I think there's a new function to press 3 for a consult with our hospital response team. I think there's a question.
Ed just said, great webinar, thanks, and I'll follow up with an email. Yeah, please do. Any questions?